our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, came out and called Bitcoin speculative and worried that regular people were going to lose lots of money in it, which is, to hear our financial authorities worrying about regular people is kind of amusing. But in other words, she set the stage for something serious to be done to cryptos. And then the Indian government right after that came out and said they were considering completely banning cryptos. So basically what you got there is the groundwork being laid rhetorically for some kind of action in which the empire strikes back against cryptos. So that's the hurdle that cryptos have to get over if they want to be a big part of the global monetary system. They have to somehow manage to get through rising global regulation, possibly confiscation, possibly a complete banning of cryptos, and come out the other end in good shape. Silver and gold will be the only forms of money that exist physically anymore, which means they've become vastly more important than they have been in the age of cash. Because, if you want to get out of the banking system and you want to protect yourself against the, inflation or whatever, you can always take a lot of money out of the bank and have cash on hand. And that doesn't protect you long term against inflation, but it gives you liquidity and flexibility in the moment. So you could always do that. Well, you can do that now. The time will come when you can't do that anymore. And that means gold and silver, they were always better than dollar cash because they were rising in price in dollar terms while dollar cash was depreciating. But now they're an absolute necessity because that's it for you as far as financial privacy goes. And they always did that job. They always allowed you to transact without anybody looking over your shoulder. But now they're the last thing that allows you to do that. So you really want some gold and silver coins now. In the past, it was an optional thing as part of a broad-based prepping program. It was a smart thing to do financially because they would go up in value. But now, not only will they go up in value, but they'll give you your only chance at financial privacy.
Some people call maple syrup liquid gold, and they think that putting it on pancakes and waffles is an idea that's pure gold. Well, at Miles Franklin, we think a pure gold idea is taking real liquid gold and turning it into real solid gold Canadian maple leaf coins. That's why right now, for a limited time, we're offering the purest gold Canadian maple leaf coins at just $105 US over spot. That's 4 nines of the purest gold there is in a pretty maple leaf design. And at only $105 US over spot, we'd say that's an idea that's pure gold.
Call me directly at 419-819-9209 or my associate at 310-562-6400 or email us at kaiser@milesfranklin.com. Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest who has been very popular with our audience. This is John Rubino. He's the founder of dollarcollapse.com, also the author, together with GoldMoney's James Turk, of The Money Bubble and several other books. He joins us this Thursday, April 1st, 2021. John, thanks for coming back on.
Hey, Don, again. Well, it's been too long. I hear you're doing really well, though.
Well, I appreciate that. And frankly, I appreciate the response from the viewers. That's really what makes it happen, because our ability to reach out to new guests and to bring back top shelf guests such as yourself who really have connections and have studied and analyzed what's going on, that really give people a perspective and awareness that we otherwise wouldn't have, is for my benefit. It's for the benefit of all of our viewers who I'm here on behalf of, to try to bring forward their questions and open up the doors. Because I just today I've gotten 3 different people have reached out to me and expressed gratitude for what we provide here, that they say, we're not going to hear this stuff on the mainstream financial channels. They're not going to tell us what's actually going on. So help us out, and your presence here is part of that. We really appreciate that. In fact, that's where I'm going to start. If I just gave you a microphone and said, I want you to tell me the top 1, 2, 3 things that you're watching with concern and that you think people need to be aware of that's unfolding right now, that's indicating, perhaps signaling signs of the times, signposts that we're passing right now that tells us maybe what's coming. Because ever since I met you back at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium back in, was that 2012 or so, you've been talking about the myriad of different risks that are present in our existing financial system and how people can take steps to reduce their exposure to that risk, which, again, they're not going to get told from most official sources. So if we asked you what are your top 3, and it doesn't have to be a perfect top 3, but among your top concerns that people should be aware of, that they may not be hearing the full story on, what comes to mind for you, and then we'll circle back into some specific viewers' questions after that.
Okay, well, the big thing that we should all be aware of now is that we have completely blown it financially from a governmental standpoint in the U.S. and most of the rest of the world. The central banks of the world and the main central governments have totally given up on any conception that borrowing too much money is a bad thing, and they're just letting fly right now. We in the U.S. I don't have to go through all the stimulus plans we've done because everybody's aware of them. But in the aggregate, we're talking 4 or 5 or 6 trillion extra dollars in one 24-month period, which is an absolutely insane amount of new debt to take on, new currency to create, and dump into the system.
I just wanted to add on to what you just said, because it's not just letting it fly. Christine Lagarde, and we had these official statements coming out of the IMF saying, spend as much as you can and then spend some more. So a direction from the IMF to countries telling governments to spend beyond their limits. And I'll put a picture of that article that came out about that declaration from officialdom. It just blew my mind.
Yeah, because not only is there not a political cost right now to borrowing huge amounts of money and spending way too much, there's a political cost to not doing that. You actually lose votes if you do not spend amounts of money that would have been considered dangerously unwise in any previous era in U.S. history. So we basically, this is the cycle that an addict goes through. Where you try to control yourself, but you fall off the wagon, and then you get back on and you try to control yourself again, and eventually you just give up and just do whatever it is you're addicted to without limits. And that's what the global financial system is now. We are addicted to debt as a global society, and we've given up trying to manage that addiction. History says it'll end really badly, but right now they don't seem to grasp that it will. Okay, so that's one of the 3 things that you asked for. The other is that because of all this money we're tossing into the system, inflation is starting to pick up. Now we've had really raging inflation for the last decade, but it's been very narrowly focused. In other words, we created a huge amount of new money, dumped it into the system, and it went into stocks, bonds, and real estate, which are not part of the consumer price index by and large. So it didn't show up as an official inflation, but it did enrich the richest people in the world. Surprise, surprise, our public policy is enriching the people who determine public policy. But now it's starting to spread. Besides stocks, bonds, and real estate, you've got industrial commodities going up in price dramatically, agricultural commodities going up in price, which means food prices are going up. So it's costing more to build a house because lumber is up. It costs more to build a car because multiple components of a car are now much more expensive. And that is going to make it harder and harder for governments to hide. So, we would have had 3 or 4% inflation for the past few years if we would had just included stocks, bonds, and real estate in the consumer price index. We didn't do that, so it looked like we had no inflation. Well, now you can't hide aluminum and copper and wheat and lumber from the public because those are things we have to buy in one form or another going forward. So everybody's starting to realize their cost of living is going up. The consumer price index is starting to show that inflation is picking up, and true to form, the Fed is saying, oh, don't worry about it. A certain amount of inflation is really good, and even a little more inflation is okay. We'll handle it. So we don't care about debt now. and we don't care about inflation.
And on this one, before I let you go on,
Yeah.
when we interviewed Jim Rickards, when we talked about John Williams from shadowstats.com and the Chapwood Index and how they're saying that we have been having inflation, and he very quickly replied, but that's not the way the Fed measures it. And that regardless of how much currency expansion they do, if you don't have money velocity, everything times zero is still zero. And so we have a question. I just couldn't resist slipping in a question here from a viewer. Cayenne Pepper Teller says, please, what will increase the velocity of money? Jim Rickard says printing money won't create it, while claiming we will get inflation once we do get money velocity. What will increase money velocity?
Well, one thing that increases money velocity is for the government to do what Biden is talking about doing now, and spend it on infrastructure. Because, you build a road, you hire a ton of people to do that work, and you buy a ton of, literally a ton or more of raw materials. That all of that is newly created currency going into people's pockets. Presumably, they will spend some of that money beyond a certain point. The other is these stimulus checks. You just hand people money. They'll do a lot of different things with it, some of which will be spending it. So we're doing things right now that will increase the velocity of money. And that'll show up as, first of all, economic growth, which, things are starting to pick back up in terms of the top line numbers. GDP is going to be pretty favorable in a vacuum. Like, if you didn't look what else was going on in the world, you'd see this big GDP number. And
if you didn't know what was going on, we look pretty good.
Yeah. But things like that will begin to increase the velocity of money. And even in the absence of an increase in the velocity of money, there's a point at which you can create enough money that even if people just spend it once instead of multiple times in the course of a year, there's so much of it out there that it will cause inflation and instability in the financial markets. And rising industrial commodities is inflation. Oh, and shipping costs are way up too. And then there's a shortage of microchips, and microchip prices are through the roof. So, inflation is showing up in a lot of different places right now. So I think that we're already past the point where we can say, oh, there's no inflation now. I mean, it's largely visible to people, and it's spreading. So that's the second thing. Third thing, interest rates are starting to rise along with inflation. And this is what creates the unsolvable problem for the world's governments, because if inflation gets out of hand, you fight it with higher interest rates and tighter money. But if interest rates start to go up, and that begins to blow up the leveraged speculating community and pretty much everybody else in the system who has to roll over debt or who has variable rate debt, which is to say almost everybody now, you normally fight that by creating a bunch of new money and pushing interest rates back down. So we're going to have two problems with mutually exclusive fixes in the not too distant future, where if we deal with inflation, we exacerbate the interest rate spike. If we push interest rates back down, we exacerbate the rise in inflation. And the psychological point that is so important in all this is that eventually people will figure out that the government can't fix this anymore, because by doing one thing, they make the other big thing worse. And so we're basically stuck in a situation with no solutions and a lot of really big, disturbing risk possibilities out there. And that could be soon, because we're already seeing interest rates spike. The 10-year Treasury yield went from 0.7% to 1.7% in the last year. With a bullet, it's still rising. Inflation, the Fed already admits inflation is going to overshoot its targets this year, and somehow they expect to fix that, to just push it back down with some magic policy option that nobody else knows about, that they think they have. So it could be that this is a this year thing, what I'm talking about, where people start to figure out that there's no fix out there and the government doesn't have the slightest idea what it's doing. But if not this year, still pretty soon. In the next few years, none of these things are going to change, it appears. Governments aren't going to pull back on their spending anytime soon, because first of all, it's fun to spend money and give it to people. And second of all, there's no cost for it politically. So they're not going to stop with the stimulus, the infrastructure, and yada yada all the way through, and all the bailouts. Don't forget we have to bail out the state and local governments at some point, and that's $7 trillion all told right there. So I think that the end game in the dollar collapse thesis, where we bump up against a crisis that's so big that governments are forced to bail out everybody in sight, that was the pandemic and the lockdowns. So we're there now. We're bailing out everybody in sight, and we're creating beyond unwise amounts of money with which to do it. And now the consequences of those things are starting to show up in ways that they can't be hidden by governments. So fascinating few years coming, but not a fun few years for most people.
A lot of people have talked about this coming financial reset, or they've coined different terms to discuss it, and they wonder if people are going to be able, if governments or people are going to be able to protect themselves with precious metals from the fiat currency collapsing around them. We've had Alistair MacLeod on several times talking about his persistent warning that the fiat currencies are in peril, and that the banking system as well. But there's been such talk about this. Don't worry, the Fed has this next digital dollar, or all the central banks have these central bank digital currencies at the ready, or almost at the ready, and just waiting for the crisis to become evident to most people, so that people will welcome that being proposed as a solution rather than having it thrust upon them. It's just like other things, other crises have had that same playbook pattern followed, where something is allowed to get worse, sometimes encouraged or fomented to get worse, and then the solution is presented, often taking away freedom or the ability to opt out along the way. So Christopher De La Rosa asked, how will the U.S.'s foray into digital currency impact the predicted dollar collapse? So we're speaking with the founder of dollarcollapse.com, so maybe you can tell us, what do cryptocurrencies in general, or specifically central bank digital currencies in the future, have to do with the dollar collapse?
Nothing whatsoever. A digital currency is still a currency. It's just that we don't get any physical currency in a digital system, right? But we're already mostly digital right now. We use credit cards, which is digital money, or we do transfers out of our bank accounts, digital money. So the next step to a totally digital dollar will be an actually really small step in the scheme of things, because it will only impact the stuff we do now that isn't digital, and that's pretty small. And you can inflate away a digital currency. Going to a completely digital dollar doesn't change the supply of dollars or anything, and it doesn't change the pressure on governments to continue to create new currency with which to support this mountain of debt that they allowed to be taken on in the past. So, I don't see a lot of economic and financial difference between today's world and a world with a digital dollar. Where there is an impact is on personal privacy and government control, because once they can track everything that you do, and they can access all of your accounts, you're no longer a free individual, are you? Because if you, let's say we get involved in yet another stupid war, and you stand up against that war, and your bank account just shows a zero balance the next day, and then who are you going to call about that? Because the government did it, And so this gives the powers that be a lot more control than they have now. Because at least right now we have the option: empty out our bank account, get a bunch of cash, turn that cash into gold and silver, something like that, and we have the ability to evade a lot of the control that governments would otherwise have. So you take away dollar cash, and then you're left with, there are still real assets you can own, but dollar cash is one less thing that you have now, and so it erodes our privacy. It increases the control that governments have over us, and to reference your show's name, it increases the necessity of prepping big time, because you cannot trust a government that has total power over your finances. Even if it's the best guys in the world who start this out. If we have Mahatma Gandhi running the Fed or Treasury at the beginning of this process, they will be replaced by Richard Nixons and Bill Clintons soon enough. People who will stop at nothing in order to exert control over the rest of us. So digital currency, which we're going to see, is a logical technological transition. We're just getting really good at running things like that. And Bitcoin was kind of a test case where we could find out how that works. And then now the major governments of the world are all going to go to digital currencies. And it'll be more convenient, but it will also have some serious downsides that we as individuals need to think about. Now, as for cryptos, interesting time for Bitcoin and the other cryptos because they've just led the early stages of a revolution in money here, and they've made their early backers wildly rich, beyond all expectations. But they've done all of this basically under the radar. To the extent that governments were paying any attention at all, I think they saw cryptos as sort of a test case, proof of concept for their own digital currencies. And now Bitcoin is getting big enough to actually be seen as a threat. So you're starting to see the groundwork be laid for either extreme regulation or absolute confiscation or banning of cryptos. Just a few examples. Christine Lagarde, who you mentioned a little while ago, in January, talked about despicable things being done with Bitcoin and called for global regulation of cryptos. And then right after that, in February, our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, came out and called Bitcoin speculative and worried that regular people were going to lose lots of money in it, which is, to hear our financial authorities worrying about regular people is kind of amusing. But in other words, she set the stage for something serious to be done to cryptos. And then the Indian government right after that came out and said they were considering completely banning cryptos. So basically what you got there is the groundwork being laid rhetorically for some kind of action in which the empire strikes back against cryptos. So that's the hurdle that cryptos have to get over if they want to be a big part of the global monetary system. They have to somehow manage to get through rising global regulation, possibly confiscation, possibly a complete banning of cryptos, and come out the other end in good shape. There are people who say no problem. Cryptos will do that for sure, and here's how they'll do it. I don't know. I don't understand what's happening well enough to have a strong opinion about that, but I think it's a big challenge. Anytime all the governments of the world decide they want something to happen, and you want something else to happen, you're facing a big challenge. So Bitcoin will see that, I think, shortly, because all the big governments want to go to their digital currencies. They certainly don't want to give up the power to make money out of thin air, which is what would happen if Bitcoin became the global reserve asset.
So there's the power. There's the power to create currency out of thin air. There's also the power to control what people are allowed to do with their currency, or whether they're allowed individuals to conduct transactions and so on.
Yes, that's the digital currency world we're looking at in the future, and the transition is going to be, again, as an economics geek, I find this stuff so fascinating. So it's in one sense it's not a good thing, but it's almost a good thing because I'm so interested in the process. But I don't think it's a good thing for these trends to succeed. The Great Reset that the guys at Davos are predicting has some good things in it. But if it's done via a global dictatorship, it's clearly not a good thing. And same thing with digital currencies. It's digital currencies are technologically interesting and very useful. But if it's part of an authoritarian government's control over the rest of us, then it's not a good thing at all. And so that's kind of the crossroads we're at here. Are we going to end up using these technologies for good or for control by a tiny elite over the rest of us? And I don't think we've answered that yet. We've got to kind of fight that battle and find out how it turns out. But the really important thing about all of this is that the battle is coming pretty soon. We've accelerated everything with the lockdowns and the massive stimulus and everything. So the next few years is when this happens, I think.
All right. So we acknowledge that there are some unknowns about that. The technology is new. The policies that will be adopted by governments to leverage that technology to maintain their power and the ability to control creation of currency, the control over people's privacy and over their transactions and so on. That leads to the next question that I think you brushed up against earlier, but we haven't really hit it head on. That's from Steve Yanni, who says, in the fast-coming digital money age, what will be the role of silver and gold?
Well, silver and gold will be the only forms of money that exist physically anymore, which means they've become vastly more important than they have been in the age of cash. Because, if you want to get out of the banking system and you want to protect yourself against inflation or whatever, you can always take a lot of money out of the bank and have cash on hand. And that doesn't protect you long term against inflation, but it gives you liquidity and flexibility in the moment. So you could always do that. Or you can do that now. The time will come when you can't do that anymore. And that means gold and silver, they were always better than dollar cash because they were rising in price in dollar terms while dollar cash was depreciating. But now they're an absolute necessity because that's it for you as far as financial privacy goes. And they always did that job. They always allowed you to transact without anybody looking over your shoulder. But now they're the last thing that allows you to do that. So you really want some gold and silver coins now. In the past, it was an optional thing as part of a broad-based prepping program. It was a smart thing to do financially because they would go up in value. But now, not only will they go up in value, but they'll give you your only chance at financial privacy. So I think the trend towards digital currency makes gold and silver that much more attractive, but also that much more of a target. See, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
If that's your last bastion of privacy, and it's the world's government's goal to eliminate financial privacy, then there's no surprise that they're going to come after gold and silver in some way. And gold is easier to mess with than silver is. Gold has been confiscated in living memory, or almost living memory, the 1930s. And it was illegal to own until 1971. So we already have a history of doing that because gold was money at the time. So it was a threat to the flexibility of the federal government. So they just eliminated that threat. Should it be a threat to government's attempt to eliminate financial privacy, then gold might be, banned or confiscated or taxed really heavily or regulated in some way. But that's tougher with silver because silver is an industrial commodity that you can't possibly ban it because it's in pretty much every piece of electronics you can think of, and it's in electric cars and solar panels, and it's needed for the modern economy. More so than ever now that we're electrifying the world. So with silver, you've got kind of a double-barreled attractiveness because even if it wasn't money historically, it would still be a really valuable industrial commodity. And as we mandate solar panels in every new house and we get rid of internal combustion engines and go completely electric, a lot of silver is going to be needed. Its price will go up just because of that. But the fact that it also functions as money means that even if it wasn't an industrial commodity, as gold is really not, it would still go up in value because old forms of money that can't be inflated away by crazy governments is going to become much more valuable going forward. So it's hard to see how silver is not a massive winner in the coming decade. And it's also kind of the small change of the precious metals world. So it's much easier to work with. You can't take a gold coin and buy groceries very easily. But you can take a couple silver coins in to a person who, at the farmer's market, where hopefully most of us end up buying our food going forward, because that's just a better way to organize a life, which is a different story. But it'll be very easy for you to find a local farmer who will happily take silver eagles or silver maple leaves or something like that in return for beef or pork or artisanal bread or honey or whatever it is they're selling at the farmers market. So you'll be able to function without using a digital currency if you've got silver. And remember, another big part of the whole digital currency trend is that if that's the only game in town, then it can be inflated with impunity. That's why we banned gold back in 1934, is because FDR wanted to devalue the dollar, but he couldn't do that if everybody had gold, or he couldn't do it as easily. So he called in as much gold as people would give him, and he immediately devalued the dollar versus gold, which means he basically he cheated the people who turned in their gold early. The governments of the world could be planning something like that, where once the dollar is completely digital, then they can just do a reset if they want to and devalue the dollar in one day, or they can do steady inflation, 5, 6, 7, 8% a year, and there's nothing we can do about it, other than immediately convert our dollars into real stuff like farmland, which of course they can tax more heavily if they want to. It has us in a box. But gold and silver will soar in that kind of an environment, although it might have to be on the black market or something. So, we'll have to see. There are no easy ways out of this, but there are things you can do to prepare in a way that some of what you've saved will survive. And that's really what we should be looking at now, is diversifying in the universe of real assets. That is, energy related assets, farmland, rental houses, gold and silver, things like that governments can't just electronically make more of. They will tend to go up in value once it becomes clear that the stated or implicit, if not stated, policy of the government is to make the dollar worth less, much less, year after year after year. So we have things we can do. It's not a perfect set of options, but getting out ahead of it now is something that you would be glad you did when things really get
right. That part is clear. The part that's less clear to me, and maybe to many of our viewers, is, as you mentioned way back in the beginning, if all the governments of the world want to do something and you want them to do something else, you have an uphill battle. Is this putting yourself, and you've said putting yourself underneath the shield of silver, for example. You didn't use that word, but you said it's actually a target. Then if it's gold and silver, E.B. Tucker, whom we interviewed on the channel, said gold is a truth serum. It makes the currency tell the truth about itself, because as gold skyrockets in, and it often does that in a leading sense, as John Williams said, it leads as an indicator to tip you off, to reveal to all that the currency is in fact collapsing in value, that through inflationary pressures the purchasing value of the currency is going down. The way you can prove that is by watching gold tell the truth. It's the truth serum. Well, in an era of deception and betrayal, which is what Jim Rawls from survivalblog.com on here says, we're living in the age of deception and betrayal. In such an era, the governments don't want any truth to get out there for people to really realize how much they're being cheated, how much they're being controlled. And so if gold and silver provide that truth signal, then how can people have confidence that they'll be able to get by? We fall back on our conventional experience. Oh, we can barter with the person down at the farmer's market. It's like, well, a lot of things we assumed we could do in the last year, we weren't doing because we were told for spurious reasons that it was unsafe to the community or whatever for us to live our lives. Alex Sunman says, how can one protect oneself in circumstances where government confiscates physical precious metals or imposes such onerous taxes as to negate the protections and benefits of owning physical PM? So if we could just belabor that a little bit longer, of the difficulties that you foresee we might be facing as holders of precious metals, trying to actually use them to conduct our daily lives in the face of an all-digital officialdom. What are some strategies that we think we have confidence that will still be available to us?
Well, when governments go beyond a certain point in terms of authoritarianism, they create black markets where people aren't willing to follow the government rules but still want to transact. So basically what they do is they convert huge sections of their society to criminals, people who are evading the rules. And it it is our obligation as currently mostly free citizens to oppose a lot of this stuff, and at the cost of maybe becoming a criminal via civil disobedience or holding gold when they try to confiscate it, things like that. We kind of are going to have to do that if we want to stand up to what's coming. And I think a lot of people are going to do that. I think the vast majority of Americans and a large number of Europeans and Asians um, will at least try to stand up to a government that's becoming more and more authoritarian. For instance, let them try to void the Second Amendment and take away everybody's guns. That would just be that would literally be a civil war. And there are a lot of other things like that where maybe it won't be just out and out warfare, but it'll be various kinds of civil disobedience, like what we're seeing now. A lot of states have decided that they're just going to open up, no matter what the federal government or the CDC says about how we should stay locked down and everything. They just said, no, Florida, Texas, we're just going to open up and we're going to let people make their own decisions. A lot of people think that way in the U.S., and a lot of those people are harmed. So I think we would, worst case scenario, where it really gets to the point where they're trying to impose something like these lockdowns on the country going forward, or financial version of that or whatever. A lot of people just won't do it. So you will be able to transact at the farmers market because a lot of people there are going to have the same attitude as you, and they'll find ways to do it. You can never stamp out black markets. Dictators have discovered that since the beginning of time, and that's and I'm talking worst case scenario here. I'm not talking what I fully expect to happen, but if it came to that, you would just see thriving black markets and all kinds of things. And we would, by definition, by legal definition, we would become criminals because we would transact that way. So I hate that we even have to talk about this, that it's even a possibility, but it.
The fact that you hate that we have to talk about it is why we named our channel originally Reluctant Preppers.
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't have to be, sure, prepare for natural disasters, sure, prepare for a bad day, sure, prepare for a layoff or whatever, prepare for an economic downturn. Those kind of things are forces of nature or mathematics, and they're going to happen. But to have to prepare for planned, designed, overt control and seizure of your property, your life, your liberty, you shouldn't have to. I mean, we've spoken with several constitutional attorneys, Dr. Edwin Vera and John Whitehead as well, who talked about there is a higher law than the law that you're disobeying when you do civil disobedience. In fact, at a constitutional level, any law that's passed that is unconstitutional is void on its face. And we have a number of states. I thought you were going there a minute ago when you said we have hope in states that are standing up and saying we're not going to take the lockdowns anymore. There's a number of states who have passed precious metals legal tender laws as well, and even moving towards establishing state depositories and that sort of thing. It's fascinating to see the liberty-loving, the freedom-loving states standing up not only for Second Amendment rights, but for sound money as well.
Yeah. There are a lot of people who see what's coming and are not happy about it at all. But of course, you have a federal government that has no problem at all opposing its will on the states, no matter what the Constitution says. So then you get into the whole secession thing, and so there's a lot of things coming, or potentially coming, that are going to seem just outrageous through today's eyes, But the fact that we're screwing up our finances on the scale that we are means that things are going to change in a really dramatic way, one way or another. I mean, you can't get out from under a massive financial era of mismanagement painlessly. So things will happen that are hard to believe, but they will happen. And there's no way to know which ones will and which ones won't happen ahead of time. We just know there's this long laundry list of stuff that has happened in the past that could happen again in the future. And we kind of have to sort through them and prepare as best we can for the most likely ones, and prepare somewhat for the less likely ones, because it really is impossible to predict exactly what kind of crazy we're going to end up with when the time comes.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you made the metaphor earlier of a addict who's finally just throws all caution to the wind and goes on a complete drunken binge, it's very unpredictable. It's very chaotic what can come out of such a binge behavior. You can't say, well, I know exactly what the outcome is going to be. No, there could be a whole bunch of bad things that could come from that. Following up on the same line of thinking, though, Manangahela says, assuming we get to keep our gold and silver, what assets are you intending to purchase when the fire sale begins for liquidity? How can we convert our gold back into assets that are ones that cash flow, and which ones would you recommend we consider?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Cash flow is the Achilles heel of precious metals. They don't pay you anything. In fact, they cost you money to store. So it would be nice to have things that generate interest. Now, right now there are very few of those because your bank account won't do it, and a government bond portfolio won't do it. Junk bonds will pay you a little bit, but they're super risky. Dividend-paying stocks, ditto. They'll pay you 2 or 3%. One category of income-producing assets, at least now, and I think in the future, would be gold and silver mining stocks. Because what's happening as gold and silver go up is the cash flow of a lot of the producing mining companies is rising beyond their needs. In other words, they're paying off their debt, they're expanding their exploration to an extent, but they still have cash left over. And then they're going to start buying each other out. But they are also going to raise their dividends. So they're going to become dividend plays at some point. But with the advantage of what they have in the ground going up in value. So they are basically, think of a gold miner as basically this big vault of gold. Only the vault is in the ground, but they periodically get some of that gold out and sell it. And so they make money that way, and they can return some of that money to you via dividends. So yeah, I think the mining stocks are just spectacularly interesting in this world because we're creating the conditions where a lot of panicked money is going to flow into precious metals at some point, sending their prices up parabolically, which means the cash flow of these gold and silver miners will go up even more steeply. And the stuff they do with it will involve handing money back to you as a shareholder one way or another, So they're a really interesting financial play in this world. Of course, they're also financial assets by definition because they're in a brokerage house, and the brokerage house could be hacked or could be confiscated by the government. They're not gold and silver in hand, so they're a different kind of thing. They're more of an investment, whereas gold and silver is money. But they're an investment that can, as your questioner said, you can convert your gold and silver into them and then generate cash flow from them as long as the financial markets continue to function.
And just before we let you go, there's kind of the bringing it back to that really broad picture, which I think is where you started, and then we zoomed in quite a bit there. Archie Valentini says, can you compare where we are now as a society to similar cases of civilizations throughout history? How did those cases play out, and how do you expect the current scenario to play out? You've already said we can't predict all the specific paths that we might take, but at in the big envelope, where do you see us measuring up to great societies or empires in the past, and what stage are we at?
Well, big empires have screwed up their currencies multiple times in the past. Just to take a couple of examples, the Roman Empire had to finance its empire somehow, and they had to keep their people happy at the same time. So just like us, they spent way too much money and they debased their currency. In other words, they took silver coins and cut holes in them and shaved them, and then eventually they mixed them with copper and stuff like that. So their currency became less and less valuable until they had hyperinflation. The value of their currency just collapsed. The Romans imposed price controls with the death penalty attached. If you were a shopkeeper and you decided to close because you couldn't make any more money with the currency being debased, they executed you. France, after the French Revolution in the 1700s, did something very similar, and it goes on and on. Governments of the world have done this, what we're doing right now, many, many times in the past, and it all ended the same way with the collapse of their currency. Now, The difference this time around is that it's not just one country. In the past, it was one country or one big empire in the context of a sound money world. Everybody else had gold and silver as their money. So you screwed up your currency, but it didn't destabilize the whole world. It was just you that had a crisis. Well, now it's the whole world. We're all making the same mistakes. And that makes this time fundamentally different because we really don't know how it's going to play out with everybody screwing up in the same way at basically the same time, because there won't be any place to hide geographically necessarily. Although you still do, by the way, want to diversify geographically if you can. Move some of your money to other countries, and hope that some of them stay reasonably sane. But yeah, so we can't know whether the fact that it's global will make it a bigger crisis or a smaller crisis. I suspect bigger because it's just more moving parts to break. You've got all these countries, some of whom are enemies, But I think that one thing that you can say for reasonably certain is that it's going to involve currencies losing value dramatically as we try to get out from under all this debt, and real assets going up in local currency terms. See, that'll be one of the things you can count on among a lot of other things that you absolutely can't predict.
Death and taxes and debasement of the currency. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, John, if people want to follow more of your work, and my goodness, you've been looking at this longer than many of us, where can they get plugged in and follow your latest analysis and writings on this?
Yeah, I've been saying stuff like this since I had black hair, so it's been a while. But I run dollarclaps.com, so come by anytime, and it's updated throughout most days, so it'll keep you up to speed on the dark side of the financial world. And we're building up a presence in social media on MeWe and Mind, which are a couple of alt social media platforms where they don't censor excessively and they don't spy. So, come over there, join our page or our group or whatever, and we can all watch this unfold together.
Oh, that's good to know, because we had to broaden out beyond YouTube. This year we've been uploading all the videos that we do upload to YouTube, where we have 52,000 and growing subscribers, also now to Brighteon and Rumble, and they tout themselves as censorship free, that sort of thing. So we certainly went through that Admageddon phase with YouTube, where many of our videos were getting demonetized, and it was really putting a squeeze on our ability to operate. Thank goodness to our viewers who helped us pull through with Patreon donations, although deplatforming has affected people on many of these places. So anyway, folks, you can find us on Brighteon and Rumble. In addition, I'm going to have to look up this MeWe and Mime. But also, folks, go to libertyandfinance.com. That's our homepage. And over on the left-hand side, you'll see where you can get our newsletter that comes out 3 times a week with all of our guests, John Rubino, all of our guests, any links that they provide, how to find them, how to reach out to any articles that we've discussed with them. By just putting in your name and address on libertyandfinance.com, we'll get you on our free email newsletter. That way, if we do get deplatformed, you'll still know where to find us. So we've been speaking with John Rubino, founder of dollarclaps.com. And John, as always, on behalf of our audience, thanks for joining us here on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks, Dunnigan.
Some people call maple syrup liquid gold, and they think that putting it on pancakes and waffles is an idea that's pure gold. Well, at Miles Franklin, we think a pure gold idea is taking real liquid gold and turning it into real solid gold Canadian maple leaf coins. That's why right now, for a limited time, we're offering the purest gold Canadian maple leaf coins at just $105 US over spot. That's 4 nines of the purest gold there is in a pretty maple leaf design. And at only $105 US over spot, we'd say that's an idea that's pure gold.
Call me directly at 419-819-9209 or my associate at 310-562-6400 or email us at kaiser@milesfranklin.com.